Peter Kiernan is here. He is an entrepreneur, philanthropist, and advisor to businesses and government. He previously spent 2 decades at Goldman Sachs, where he was a senior partner. His new book is called American Mojo. It considers the growing threat to the future of the middle class in America. I'm pleased to have Peter Kiernan at this table. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here.
This grew out of a conversation you had with a young businessman in China.
It did, actually. I was walking along in the Bund in Shanghai, and I just finished a book that had something to do with China. And we'd become good friends, and he said, you know, I've studied America thoroughly, and I think I understand. I think I get you. But there's one thing that baffles me. We're trying so hard to create a middle class. It's so difficult to do. And you have one of the great middle classes ever created in history, and you're systematically dismantling that. And why? Just share with me. What's the strategy behind that? Why are you doing that? And I fumbled through what was a terrible answer, I'm sure, at the time. But the whole flight back, I was thinking, why are we doing that? That doesn't make any sense. And that really was how one book literally led to another. And that's what led to the birth of this book.
So what's the answer to the question?
Well, I think the answer is that we have to look at the middle class differently, because it's a totally different construct today than what we once experienced. And anytime you try and solve a problem by looking through the rearview mirror, you're going to screw things up. We've got a middle class today that is so different in so many ways. And add to that, when we created our middle class after World War II, when 16 million GIs came through, it was an extraordinary thing, Charlie, because the entire country worked together. Business, government, law, all came together, reaching out a sense of duty and entitlement and loyalty to the people had fought. At that time, the rest of the world's manufacturing lay in ruins, and we rose to the occasion. That's not the fact pattern today, nothing close to it. And so we have to realize that there's a whole new playing field, and it's a global playing field.
And it's very competitive.
And as you say, the OECD says there'll be 1 billion more members of the middle class outside our borders in the next 10 years.
What's interesting to me, too, is if you look at the emerging economies, I mean, the reason those emerging economies, whether the BRIC countries included, was the idea that they created a middle class, which created some buying power, which enabled their economy to grow and enabled them to become an export economy in some cases. But it was the middle class that fueled the growth of their economies.
Absolutely. And when you talk to the leadership in those countries, and each of the BRICS is $1 trillion economy plus, and what they're saying is, we believe the key to driving this is having a strong middle class. And they are doing things, much like we did after World War II, they're doing things to support, nurture, develop, grow their middle class at a time when we're being casual and sort of letting our middle class go by the wayside.
But are you saying that the reason our middle class is in trouble is because we no longer have the impetus of being alone as we were after World War II? That the competition has simply done things that are necessarily not to the benefit of our middle class?
Well, here's how I'd answer that. There's certainly a home game and an away game answer to that question. The home game answer is that we have failed to recognize that we have an extraordinarily talented group of people in our country, but we're not managing that talent appropriately. So, for example, in the next 10 years, we're going to create, in this majestic economy, this $15–16 trillion economy, we're going to create 1.25 million computer jobs, computer science jobs in this country. That is a fantastic element of creation, because every one of those jobs is a multiplier job, so it means more people get hired. Well, let's look how we're doing at the talent management side. We're graduating about 40,000 students a year in computer science. So over 10 years, that's 400,000. So that's 800,000 or 900,000 jobs short. And everywhere you go, if you talk to Jeff Immelt, if you talk to the people who are running the big corporations, they say, we have, in Microsoft, et cetera, we have thousands and thousands of jobs, and when you amalgamate them, it's probably 4 million skill-based jobs that do not need to be created. They're there. They need to be filled.
Yeah, but the key is skill-based jobs.
It is skill-based jobs. And one of the things we have to do, we must do, is recognize that as we let go of one trapeze bar and float as we are in midair, there is another trapeze bar coming our way, and we have to train ourselves and spend the money. And the question is, can we do it? I believe we can. I believe there's a homegrown opportunity to do that. But it means we're going to have to change a lot of things.
What do we mean by middle class?
Middle class has gone through a big change And one of the things that I've said, once upon a time was a block of granite. It was largely white, and you could define it by what people earned. Today, our face of America is so dramatically changed that you can't use the old measurements. And I'll give you one example. Today in the United States, there are about 45 million poor people, which is entirely too many. But just above that seam of the poverty line are another 50 million people who are what I call in the book hovering poor. One twist of life's knife away from a trip down to an experience in poverty.
One disaster to the family.
One of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the lower middle class is a cancer diagnosis.
Right.
A car accident. And what happens is suddenly you have 40% of the kids in this country will spend some of their childhood on food stamps. What we have to realize is that the middle class has got a whole new dynamism, a whole new energy. So we have about 50 million Latino and Hispanic people in the United States, and of that there's probably 10 to 15 million who would qualify almost by any definition as middle class.
You know, if you ask the political candidates this year, starting with Hillary Clinton, who just made a huge speech about this, they all know that this is America's crisis, what's happening to the middle class. But you don't see that many so far really unique and creative and innovative ideas. They know, for example, that the middle class is not as well off as it was. They know that they're the children of the middle class. Their expectations are not the same as theirs might have been. I mean, they understand all this, but they're searching for a kind of narrative, and a strategy.
One of my great frustrations, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, in fact, my publisher said, don't come out in the middle of the election. I said, no, I deliberately want to come out in the middle of the election because I think there are a lot of people who are talking about being champion of the middle class. There are 20 people now running, and all 20 want to be champion.
Yeah, because they know that's where the votes are.
And the problem is that you can increase the minimum wage. We've done it 7 times since Reagan, so do it 8.
Right.
You can, as the president has done, say we have to pay people who are working overtime, time and a half. And those begin to solve the problem. I would call them necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. And I'll give you an example. If you think of every person in the city of Los Angeles, every single soul, and add to that every single soul in the city of Philadelphia, that's how many people there are today in our country between the ages of 16 and 25 who are what I call NEETs. They're not in employment, education, or training. So if you go just a few miles from here down to the DeKalb Avenue exit on the subway, and you will see a dozen young people sitting around right now. That's not an after-school program that's going to achieve anything. We have to do something. We cannot allow someone to be 22 years old who's not reading or writing up the skill base, who may have been incarcerated with no options, no job prospects, no future. That is a very expensive anchor on the middle class. But there are some creative things you could do. I'll give you one example that I talk about in the book. Everyone agrees that we have a major problem with our infrastructure. That's not a contested debate. The big debate is how you pay for it. And I think we could pay for it right now. And I'm going to go back to World War II as an example. In 1941, we made 3 million cars in this country. From 1941 to the end of the war, because FDR said we're not in the car business anymore, we did not make 150 cars. Because we had to basically move our economy to where the need was. We have to do the same sort of thing today. And I have a way without raising a penny of taxes that might help, which is to create American Infrastructure Development Bank, a bank that will not do subprime loans, it won't do derivatives, it will only spend money on infrastructure. Now, let's commit right here to raise $1 trillion. And I believe to do that, and a development bank would need $300 billion of equity. I believe if we went to every corporate pension fund, if we went to every union pension fund, so we're going to put your people to work, invest in this development bank. If we went to every 1%er, if we went to the government, we could get $300 billion of equity.
The development bank would lend money to rebuild the infrastructure.
Yes, it would.
And put people to work.
And how would we get the loans on top of that? I think we would do that by doing a war bond. And if we went to the American people and said, now is the time for all good people to come to the aid of our country. We've just raised $1 trillion. And that $1 trillion is going to go to fund not just roads and bridges and the obvious infrastructure, but the more subtle, more powerful kinds of infrastructure. Through Robin Hood, I'm involved in a school, and we had a problem that the kids were hanging out at the school on the steps at night, even in the cold fall nights. And we sent somebody up to say, what is going on? And the reason the young people were there It was the only place they could get Wi-Fi. We have a digital divide. There are other kinds of pipelines in Keystone that we need to build. We need to build the kind of infrastructure that's going to have young people able to get Wi-Fi wherever they live.
So when the Obama administration came in and they had a Democratic Congress, they created a stimulus program.
They did.
$800 billion.
Yes.
With some tax advantages as well, which Republicans insisted on. What happened?
Two things happened. One, I would never confuse an orgy of spending with the stimulus program. And one of the things
This was an orgy of spending.
This was an orgy of spending. Oh my gosh, new uniforms for the TSA. I'm not degrading the TSA anyway, but is that really a stimulus matter? Libraries getting some money where they had 1 or 2 employees. A stimulus program is something where you do several things. You engage people in the recreation of the economy. You uplift them by giving them jobs. And you do one more thing. You basically build American momentum. That's not what happened. Another thing that we have to create.
Who's responsible for that?
Well, I think it's a shared responsibility, and it's a great thing because everybody owns it, but no one really does. And what I would do if I were king is to say, I think every state, every municipality ought to have a department of regulatory sanity. Just somebody who sits down and says, how can we get things shovel ready? Because a lot of people that I talked to in Washington when I was researching the book said, that really would have worked, but we just didn't have enough stuff that's shovel ready. So you're telling me that our infrastructure
project we could start immediately.
Immediately. Did that stop FDR? You know, we have had a history of figuring out a way to solve the shovel-ready program. Don't come to me if you're running for a president of this country and say, the problem with our infrastructure is we don't have things that are shovel-ready. Get them shovel-ready. That is a problem that manpower and womanpower and brains can resolve. But those two things starved what was a unique, I would say almost Churchillian opportunity to rebuild our infrastructure, to rebuild the jobs we're talking about. But that's just one example.
Or a man on the moon urgency or a Manhattan Project urgency.
Exactly so. Exactly so. And the same way that FDR somehow persuaded Ford Motor to not make cars anymore and to make airplanes for World War II, you know, the government is cloaked in immense power. And leadership means that you have to go and solve the dire problems.
I interview one national security person after another, and at least half of them will say the biggest problem facing our national security is not overseas. It's domestic, and it is sort of gridlock in Washington. And you talk about ostriches, domestic ostriches,
yes,
in your book.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've done is we've allowed ourselves to create not just a Democrat-Republican divide. We're used to that. We have an architecture of divide that we've created now. And that means that things like lobbyists, which used to be sort of a cottage industry, is now a multi-billion-dollar industry with millions of professionals practicing it. Think tanks, there are think tanks out there with bigger endowments than some small colleges. That we basically have influencers into policy that play games that wind up at stalemate. Now, you and I know from looking at many, many problems, no great problem ever got solved by one sector alone. Business can't solve it alone. Philanthropy, government, they have to work together on rebuilding the middle class. It can be done.
But every president says he's coming to Washington, or she comes to Washington, to create the bipartisanship that built the country. And then they run into one problem after another.
The muck. It's very, very hard. I'll say this, I would fault business. I think business's brand is broken. I think it's been harmed since 2008. And I would wish that the leaders of the business community would say, here is the way forward. And acknowledge that whatever happened in 2008 was an aberration and something that we're going to protect against. But it shouldn't block us. One of the things that we've done many times in the course of our history is had a government that spoke with business fluency. We had leaders from business working in government for $1 a day, and that is the kind of energy that we need to create. Now, some of it is being done in the country. If you go to places like Houston, Houston is called something the Greater Houston Partnership, and they are bringing in the academic leaders, the religious leaders, the government leaders, the
NGO leaders.
Exactly, and saying, how do we build our economy here? And I'll give you one example that shows it's working. The number 3 city in the country for foreign consulates is Houston, Texas. so Washington, New York, Houston. That's not because of proximity to the State Department. Something is happening there.
But I would have, I mean, I'm surprised at that because I would have assumed it would be San Francisco because of the proximity to Silicon Valley.
Well, Silicon Valley is where the energy, and I would by that translate it also to New York, the energy of the new jobs we're creating. Remember that McKinsey just did a study that said we're going to wind up with, in 10 years, 1.5 million too few college graduates, that we're creating phenomenal jobs. And anybody says America's lost its energy, if you go out to the Silicon Valley and spend time there, as I have, people are sparkling with ideas. The energy to create new businesses, to disrupt, and to serve those middle-class people that are going in all these countries around the world.
An interesting thing, I was just with Ash Carter, Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, sure.
And he was speaking to a group of people, essentially from Silicon Valley. And he basically was saying, we have to have a partnership here because in a lot of areas where government used to do the research and development, obviously the internet came from government projects at the Department of Defense. And it was an outgrowth of that and in coordination with business. He basically was saying we have to have a partnership because a lot of the new research and development, you people are so far out ahead of the world and government here, we have to figure out a way to have you bear a significant part of the burden of innovation and creating new approaches that have at their base technology.
We're starting to see that in biotechnology and some other areas where the NIH is less the funder and more the instigator.
Or giving the seed.
But once the commercialization opportunity begins to break over the horizon, now, one of the things that troubles me is that I don't think we have enough supportive legislation for venture capital. Venture capital in 2000 was over $100 billion a year. In the last year, it's been about 25 or 26 billion. It's way, way down. And I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that small businesses are the cradle of job creation. For anybody who's running for office, and on one level I care, but I would like anybody who's running for office to say, whatever we do, let's move heaven and earth to create the great jobs. And so if somebody wants to invest in a startup business, you can cut out the 1%. I don't care. But if you have a startup business that employs people and you go for 3 or 4 or 5 years and that business prospers and you sell some of it or all of it, you should get a tax break because that's how the great jobs get created. And great jobs are momentum creators. It's a pebble in the water. They are multipliers on jobs.
When you look at the discussion of the middle class, you also have to address the idea of income inequality.
Yeah. Look, there's an orgy of evidence that shows that we've got concentration at the top, not just here, but across the world. There are 85 people, we could fit them in this room, who own more than most everybody else.
Right.
So we have two massive forces in our economy, in my opinion. One that creates a very small group of people who are very, very rich, and another that is creating new record highs in hunger, in homelessness, and poverty. And we have to acknowledge that somehow those two factoids, those two Newtonian certainties like gravity, have to be relegated. Now, how do you do it? I think by simply taking money from one and giving it to another is only a beginning. It's what I would say to anybody who wants to tax the
Well,
richest.
the transference of wealth in some
Sure.
cases.
And you know what? If you want to do that, I actually don't think personally, this notion that you work your life and you spend and then you die, and after you die, the government takes a big chunk of what you have is a terrible way to redistribute wealth. So there's going to be the greatest transference of wealth ever coming when this generation passes on and learns that you can't take away.
Against an estate tax?
Not at all. And people who say you can't tax it twice, I don't know where it's written. I'd like to see what business Bible it says you can't tax money twice. I'm just not a believer in that. But I do think that one of the tests that we should have for anybody who's running for office to say, I'm going to tax more, is great, tax more. What are you going to do with the money? What's your plan? You've got this bucket of money from the 1%. What do you plan to do with it? Are you going to have something with those NEETs, those 6 million kids who are literally doing nothing between the ages of 25 and 16 years old? Are you going to help them? Are you going to go, and here's another one I love to tell, is that people say education's the answer. Okay, you're going to fund education. Just how great does a teacher have to be? We have 4 million teachers in our K through 12 public system here. That's an army of excellence for us. That is a unique selling proposition for the United States. But the trouble is If you think of everybody in the city of Dallas, that's how many kids today are going to go out of the building when the school bell rings and have no home to go home to. 1.3 million kids are going to leave school today with no place to go but the shelter or a tent or wherever they can sleep. How good does that teacher have to be for the 8 hours that student's in class if they're hungry, if they're homeless? You know, we have survival issues that we have been in denial about. We have to. There's no stimulus program, no race to the top good enough or strong enough if your stomach is gurgling and you haven't slept because you've been fearful.
Not only that, malnutrition affects cognitive ability and everything else.
It does. And I was just with somebody in the hospital said, you know, the biggest indicia of poor health in this country, by far, not your DNA, is poverty. Yeah. And these things all run together. And so whomever is going to lead us after the president steps down and we have a new one has got to address these things in an engaged and interconnected way, not in silos.
The book is called American Mojo, Lost and Found, Restoring Our Middle-Class Values Before the World Blows By. Peter Kiernan. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.